You're immune to propaganda, disinformation, and misinformation, right? You think critically. You can see through nonsense. Unfortunately, I guarantee that you were wrong. And I thought that recently. I'm pretty cynical. I'm pretty skeptical of most things I see online. So I thought I was immune from propaganda, but it turns out that I am not. Because if you show me something that reinforces my beliefs, I'm way more likely to believe it, even if there's no evidence for it. And that is true of all of us, because that is how we are wired. But we need to get way better at this. This is one of the reasons that we are becoming so polarized, so extremist in our viewpoints, and why we can no longer have debates with people we disagree with. We not only need to get better at this because we have a whole lot of problems that we need to solve together, but also because with the rise of AI and the horrifying fact that people can't even tell that that great white shark is not real, the one where she's hugging it in the water, it's clearly AI, guys. With the rise of AI that is just going to get better and better and better, we are soon not going to be able to tell what's real and what's not. So we need to start being more skeptical, more media literate, and better at looking for things like consensus and sources and evidence. One of my favorite examples of this is an example of misinformation in two different ways. I'm sure you know of the movie War of the Worlds, so it's actually a book. And in 1938, a radio broadcast a part of it like a news bulletin, like a breaking news, aliens are invading, and people didn't take it very well. They went a little bit crazy. They got a little bit panicked. There was rioting in the streets. There was people caught holding bottles of poison for, better that than the aliens, apparently. Hospitals were filled with people, and everybody assumed it was the end of the world. Except there's absolutely no evidence for that at all, because the story used to talk about how quickly misinformation spreads is also misinformation, which is kind of hilarious. None of that is true. There is no evidence for any kind of widespread panic. There was absolutely a radio bulletin, but the vast majority of people used their heads and realized that's a book. Perhaps the least extreme example, last year there was a tweet posted on X or Twitter, whatever, and it was talking about how volcanoes release more CO2 in 1 year than all human activity entirely. It spread freaking fast, and it was over 120,000 views before NIWA scientists were like, no, that's not the case at all. Have some evidence. Unfortunately, there are still thousands, probably tens of thousands of people who still believe that to be true because I saw one thing on Twitter and ran with it. Because it reinforced a belief that we all really want to believe, right? Which is that climate change isn't our fault. Because wouldn't that be a nicer reality? Unfortunately, it's not the reality. When NIWA provided the correction, that one tweet had already made it onto radio stations and into mainstream media. And because they didn't do any fact checking, that belief now appears in most comment sections on almost any video I make about climate change. And why do we do this? It's because our brains favor speed over accuracy, right? MIT researchers and a bunch of other people who have since looked at how misinformation spreads tracked rumors on Twitter and found that they spread between 4 to 6 times faster than real information. And that's because fake news or misinformation tends to fall into one of 3 categories, right? It's novel, so it's new and therefore exciting, or it's emotional, usually it generates some kind of rage, or it reinforces those beliefs people have, so it is much more likely to be shared. That's called confirmation bias, right? When we see something that confirms what we already believe, we're therefore more likely to believe the thing we see. Then you get the illusory truth effect, where basically the more you say something, the more likely it is to be true. And now we have a whole bunch of people who believe that daddy long legs are the most venomous spiders in the world, despite the fact that they are definitely not. At the beginning of this video, I used 3 terms that are used interchangeably but do actually mean different things: propaganda, misinformation, and disinformation. Propaganda is the evil one, right? Everybody knows that governments use it to manipulate people inside and outside their countries. And they do, to be fair, but also companies use it. Tobacco is a great example because scientists knew that tobacco was bad for us way earlier than it became public knowledge, because tobacco companies fired back with propaganda designed to make you think that tobacco was not only safe, but had lots of good effects too. That is the same playbook, of course, that oil companies use when it comes to climate change and microplastics. If a claim's main job is to push you to believe someone else's agenda, that's probably propaganda. Misinformation is something that we are all guilty of, right? It's the thing that your well-meaning family member says at Christmas dinner. They forward you a study that they like the headline of. They don't have any intent to deceive, but they just believe it to be true and they wanted to share it on. It's just bad facts doing the rounds, right? We all do this to some degree because who fact checks everything they say? You can't, right? There's so many beliefs inside that we don't even necessarily know about. It would be impossible to fact check everything. And that's where intent comes in, because disinformation is like misinformation's evil twin. Disinformation is done when they know it's incorrect, but they are still spreading it anyway because they want something. This is done by companies, governments, politicians, lobbyists, you name it. A lot of people do this to try and achieve a goal. Obviously, there's overlap between disinformation and misinformation. How do you know if someone knew? And does it even really matter if they did anyway? Yes, it does. Disinformation is intent to deceive. Misinformation is just being wrong. We're all wrong quite often. There is no harm in being wrong. There is a lot of harm in deliberately lying to people because you want to achieve something. But why does any of this matter, right? We all know that the internet is full of nonsense. Well, have you noticed how things are a little bit more difficult lately? People are more extreme in their views. We are polarized. The left is much further apart than the right, even though those are really just stupid categorizations of people because we're far too complex to go into just two buckets. People parrot things they see online without any idea whether it's true or not. And even when things have been debunked by authorities and experts in the space, people are much more likely to be like, no, that's not true because we don't trust experts anymore. The information is the raw material for every single decision we make. It informs what we buy, what companies we buy from, and therefore who we support, who we vote for, the future we plan for. And when you twist the information, you twist the decision and therefore the outcome. I know people, and I'm sure that you do as well, who are what you would call open-minded and tolerant and kind and thoughtful. And they start to move along this path of disinformation campaigns. And they start to believe things that you think are a little bit odd. And it gets worse and worse and worse until all of a sudden they've become part of some fringe belief group. This is how you end up with those extremist groups. It doesn't happen overnight. Each lie builds upon the previous one, making the subsequent one seem more likely. And then you have a bunch of people thinking that Andrew Tate is just misunderstood and really he's a good guy. And that leads to some pretty dark places. Obviously, the anti-vaccination campaigns are a good example here because this is where it kills people. There was an outbreak of measles in Samoa in 2019 that killed 83 people, mostly children. And this was because of repeated vaccine disinformation campaigns, taking the vaccination rate down to about 30%. And these disinformation campaigns were capitalizing really horrendously on the tragic death of 2 children who received the vaccine that had been mixed improperly. Instead of mixing the vaccine with water before they injected it, the nurses injected the vaccine with a muscle relaxant. Unfortunately, those 2 children died, and that started a campaign of vaccines kill children. One of the people who, of course, made that worse was RFK, who travelled to Samoa in 2019, meeting with some of those anti-vaxxers and further bolstering their message. And something that made it even worse was, naturally, those families with sick children took those children to traditional healers. And those traditional healers had been sold immunity water machines by Australian wellness companies that had absolutely no evidence or even logic behind it. So they treated these sick kids with this immunity water, which of course had no effect. And unfortunately, by the time they took them to doctors, it was often too late to treat those kids. That is a very sad, very frustrating example of why it really matters that we stop believing all the myths and disinformation out there. And as an aside, I find it so interesting, right? So many anti-vaxxers talk about Big Pharma being evil, and they're certainly not angelic by any stretch, right? But they never talk about big wellness, the wellness industry, which is 3 to 4 times larger than Big Pharma and more profitable. So the people who have no evidence behind them make more money from it are the ones doing the good things, and yet the scientists who make very little money on average, who will do an awful lot of work and have a lot of checks and balances, they are the ones that are villainized. Now, it doesn't just cost lives, of course. It slows down and stops all sorts of action, right? There are so many examples I could use here. I talked about tobacco earlier. Scientists knew that smoking was carcinogenic back in the 1940s, and they tried to warn people, but tobacco companies put out loads and loads of propaganda, but were drowned out by those tobacco companies. Same deal with climate change. Scientists knew about this problem decades ago. In fact, oil companies did as well. But then companies like ExxonMobil, Chevron, Shell, BP, they spent hundreds of millions of dollars on PR to confuse people, delay action, and more recently convince people that it's too late to even bother doing anything now, so meh. And every month of delay adds about 2 gigatons of CO2 to our atmosphere, which is about 40 years of Aotearoa's emissions every single month that we delay. That's the power of misinformation. And of course, it also affects democracy. In the 2016 election, everybody's talked about the Russian bots that come from troll farms. Well, those farms created about 126,000 Facebook posts and about 80,000 ads pushing memes of Hillary Clinton plotting a Muslim takeover, spreading fake headlines like the Pope endorsing Trump, which he didn't, and urging left-leaning voters to skip the vote and protest instead, which is quite a smart move, I will give them that. Fast forward to the 2020 election, and of course it was all about how the election was stolen. Facebook pages, talk show hosts, podcast bros. They all made up that mail-in ballots were rigged, voting machine changed votes. There was a slogan called #StopTheSteal, which made about 400 million impressions in just 6 weeks. And Trump himself even repeated it. In fact, he still does. And yet a bipartisan Senate report later confirmed there's absolutely no evidence of fraud. Yet still, about 1 in 4 Americans believe that the 2020 election was rigged. There is no evidence whatsoever. And a whole bunch of you are like, well, of course there was no evidence. So what's your evidence that it was? Is it just a gut feeling? When you are feeling defensive about your belief, instead of getting mad, I urge you to just dig into why and have a think about why you're so determined to protect that belief. It's a really healthy thing to do, and it's a thing that very few people do because it reduces your own ego, right? But the more you challenge your own beliefs, the more informed you become, the more thoughtful you become, and the less extreme. Because at the end of the day, we all want the same thing. We just differ in our opinion of how to get there. That's okay. But of course, all that misinformation about stopping the steal is what led to the January 6th assault on the Capitol. Misinformation can lead directly to violence. And our election here in Aotearoa wasn't spared either. There was anti-co-governance Facebook groups and podcast bros, again, claiming that Labour had a secret plan to confiscate private land and all sorts of other nonsense. And follow-up polling has found that, again, about 1 in 4 of the undecided voters still believe one of those claims at the time of the election. Fake news sticks, and when people don't really have anything real to point to, they just make stuff up. There are countless examples, but I don't want this video to go on too long. What I want this video to do ultimately is to give you some examples of what to look for. Broadly speaking, there's 6 tactics that companies and governments and people use. Number 1 is astroturfing, which is a bizarre term. It's got nothing to do with fake grass, but it's when groups with a very specific agenda will put on like a nice community mask to hide who funds them and what ultimately their goal is. The best example of this is, again, in the US. There was a group called Citizens for Affordable Energy, which sounds good, right? We all want affordable energy. It's funded by the Koch brothers, who are, of course, eyeball deep in the fossil fuel industry, not renowned for being good people. The billionaires behind Koch Industries have funneled hundreds of millions of dollars into anti-climate change lobbying. Another tactic is cherry-picking experts and using them weirdly. Media producers froth over a fight because it draws more eyeballs. So you see the same contrarian scientists pop up everywhere, right? There are 3 contrarian scientists that are used a lot, way more than any other scientist in the climate change debate. The biggest reason, of course, is there's so few scientists who have any expertise in relevant areas that are actually anti, who say that climate change isn't real. But you've got a geologist who says that CO2 is plant food. And before you say, but it is. Yeah, it is, but it's a bit more complicated than that. And then you have an engineer who just blames the sun. But they get equal airtime with the hundreds of peer-reviewed climatologists who are actual experts. They do not deserve to be in these conversations. They don't have the knowledge or the expertise, but who cares? You see this a lot in articles, and I have talked about it before, and there is an article on my Substack about it should you want to read some more in depth. But it's a good rule to remember that just because someone has, say, a PhD in one area or is a doctor doesn't mean they have expertise over here. Scientific expertise tends to be very narrow. Then you've got emotive language. This is something people don't even know is happening, but it's very, very effective. So groups come up with slogans like keeping the lights on, jobs versus the planet, pitching it as an either or the infamous Ute tax, which are designed to specifically fire you up by positioning something as a fight and like ping your lizard brain before you even actually know what any of it's about. They've already predisposed you to have an emotional reaction, and you don't even know why. Some organizations specialize in manufacturing doubt. So if public opinion starts going one way, lobbyists come out with things like, maybe, but I think we just need more research first. They've not even said anything and not presented any evidence. They've said something which on the face of it seems fairly reasonable. And they say it even when you have 97% scientific consensus. Visual misdirection is another one that you'll be very familiar with without even necessarily being familiar with the tactic. Why do you think BP's logo is green and shaped like either a flower or the sun, depending on your perspective? That's very specifically chosen to evoke good feelings about the company, right? Despite the fact that they are a fossil fuel company at the heart. That is visual misdirection. You'd be surprised how powerful colours can be. And the final tactic is what you're seeing a lot of right now, which is outrage amplification. I said fake news travels faster earlier, so does outrage. A memo from Meta back in 2023 stated that posts that sparked outrage or disgust travelled about 25% further than a more normal post. The louder the shouting, the more reaction, therefore the more the algorithm boosts it. I mean, in fact, this is a well-known marketing strategy. If you want to stand out on TikTok, marketing gurus will tell you to say something controversial, even if you don't believe it, which is kind of gross. So now you know the tactics. How do you actually stop it? Well, that is the million-dollar question, right? People study human behavior for decades to try and understand how we actually get through the lizard brain reaction and into the thinking part. I'm actually doing some philosophy papers because thinking about how we think is weird sounding, but actually really fascinating. So a couple of tips. If you read something and it sparks any kind of emotion, whether it's rage, delight, whether it's feeling smug because you were right, take a deep breath. And instead of sharing it or taking it as written, go and find proof. Open a new tab and just run a background Google search. Try and find the ultimate source of the information. It's often a scientific study that is misrepresented in media. This isn't a difficult thing to do. It's a time-consuming thing to do, which is why, I wouldn't expect you to do it for everything. But big things, maybe fact-check them. This is going to be more and more important, of course, as I mentioned, with AI being more and more realistic. Look for the funding. Every study, every think tank, every Facebook report, somebody funded it, right? And quite often that's public information. At the bottom of every scientific study, there are funding disclaimers. And in a profit journal, they should be complete. They should also state whether they have any conflicts. Now, just because they do, or just because they are funded by the organization behind it, doesn't necessarily mean that that information is not true, but it is something to be aware of. Funding can absolutely make a difference in intent. And when you find that original source, does the original source actually agree with the thing that you've read? So many times I have read some amazing, outrageous headline talking about how wonderful something is or how this is the cure to cancer. And then you read the study and it was, done on 5 mice. And the researchers themselves were like, well, this is interesting news, but it doesn't prove anything. And yet the media headlines are like, cure of cancer. And this is why people believe that the cure to cancer was discovered decades ago, and yet Big Pharma is sitting on it. This is why people don't believe in science anymore, because they think it flip-flops. When in reality, scientists are some of the most annoying people to talk to ever because they're so hard to pin down to something. They need to be convinced with evidence, whereas journalists will print something that makes you want to click it. I mean, it's not their fault. There's an awful lot of pressure on journalists, but our responsibility as readers is to maybe look a little bit deeper. And when you can't do that, keep an eye out for consensus, right? To use the climate change example again, if 97% of scientists are for something, that's probably a good sign that it's true. Whereas if you've only got 1 or 2 podcast bros talking about how it's actually just a solar cycle, they might just be selling t-shirts. Consensus isn't sacred, right? None of these are silver bullets, which is just confusing. But overturning scientific consensus does take a shitload of evidence, right? It's not just a podcast microphone, ironically. And then there's 2 more things I think we should all do. And number 1 is curate your feed. Most of us are on social media, and eventually it becomes a bit of an echo chamber of your belief systems, right? Because you interact with things you like, and eventually, if your feed is anything like mine, it's mostly just cute animals and environmental information. That's great, but that's not really the real world. So try and follow a spread of credible outlets, even ones that you don't necessarily agree with. So science communicators, political commentators, whoever they are, just make sure you don't exist in an echo chamber of your belief systems. You can get rid of rage baiters. They're not helpful at all, but make sure there is a few voices in there that you kind of disagree with. And then finally, be responsible with your sharing. How many times have we all seen someone share something we know isn't true, or we've done it ourselves, right? If you wouldn't stake your reputation on that claim, if you wouldn't say it in front of your grandma at the dinner table, maybe don't put it on your stories. Getting something wrong is absolutely fine. We are all wrong at times, and admitting that is part of being human. Getting something wrong is fine, right? It's part of being human. We all get things wrong quite often. The most reliable, intelligent people on earth are the ones who are the most willing to change their minds and admit they are wrong based on new evidence, which is a skill. If you do even 1 or 2 of these things often enough, it kind of comes like muscle memory, and you become that cynical person in your group who people run things by. I shouldn't actually say cynical, really. I should say skeptical, because skepticism is largely the backbone of proper science. Scientists, we don't believe anything until there is evidence for it. And that's an important attitude for all of us to cultivate. It's okay to say, I don't know yet, or I don't have an opinion because I haven't seen any evidence. The world would be a better place if more of us did that. It's funny because even talking about misinformation riles people up, which is what it's intended to do, right? There is a link between our egos and our sense of self and our belief system. So when you chip away at people's beliefs, it feels inherently personal. So the important thing to do is to do this when you're talking to someone about something they believe that you don't think is true, is to approach the conversation from a place of mutual understanding. And because I think this is very important, it is actually something I'm going to do a whole other episode on in a couple of weeks' time. But until then, I have our next book giveaway for you. Reading's at an all-time low. We are losing the love and the skill of reading, and it's such a shame. I was that kid who used to sit outside on the swings when I was made to go and play outside and read a book. My parents worried about me, I think. But the fact that we're reading less is showing in things like literacy rates and just general knowledge. So every week we're going to be giving away a couple of copies of a book that was somewhat relevant to the podcast, maybe, but it is a book that we think you should read. And this week it's 6 Conversations We're Scared to Have, which was written by Deborah Frances White. It's like a sharp, funny guide on how to have conversations about what I've just been talking about, like race, politics, privilege, climate change, without people throwing rocks at you, which I think is a perfect fit for today's theme. Next week I'm talking about mining the deep sea, which is obviously a terrible idea, but here we are anyway. Kia ora, and I will see you next week.